Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So there's a little bit of construction going on out here outside my building. So if you can't hear me, let me know at any point, and I'll shut the door. I'd rather not because it gets a little warm, but if that's the case, let me know. So let's start off by taking our volunteers as usual, the usual drill, and as usual, Akasha volunteers. Who else? Anyone else?
I'll try.
Miriam? Okay. Next. Particularly if you haven't volunteered much in the past, you might want to try. Kareem, you want to volunteer? Maya?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Jana, do you want to volunteer?
Honestly, not today. Sorry.
Okay. Sarah?
Yes, I can volunteer.
What did you say? I didn't hear you very clearly.
Yes, I can.
Okay. All right then. Okay, we have our volunteers. If someone else arrives, there aren't too many today. People are starting to fall off a little bit here. Okay, so last time we were just going through the text. For today, you were supposed to read the New Atlantis. Any thoughts about the New Atlantis?
It's definitely not like anything we've read so far.
Yeah.
It's obviously written for entertainment, and from its form, I mean, at the time, maybe the form of a story or a novel was more interesting to people.
Yeah.
But throughout reading it, I tried to link it to Plato's Atlantis, and I couldn't really find an obvious link. So I feel like that would be an interesting aspect to examine.
Yeah. Did you try to link it with what Bacon thinks about science?
Well, yeah. I mean, that was the obvious thing there.
Yeah.
It was like a transition from religion to more science and religion. But yeah, that was it.
So a general question for everyone. Is the New Atlantis, I mean, obviously I kind of spoiled it a little bit by letting you know that Bacon was a certain unusual character. And although it's for entertainment, surely there are some jokes in it, particularly about the marriage thing. That's obviously some kind of a joke involved in that. But for the most part, it's serious, I think, right? It is supposed to be entertaining, but it's also serious, and he chooses to represent things in a certain way, which will repay as we see. Thinking about, like, why does he make the choices? The society seems very familiar in some respects, but not probably what you expected from the father of modern science. This is his, it's not the Jetsons. It's not people flying around on technological, flying cars, or people living forever, or there is sci-fi in it, certainly. But was it what you expected by any means? and we'll see there are some really interesting, I don't know if you guys could even answer this at this point, but maybe I'll ask it anyways. When people are, there, as I say, I used this term at some point earlier in the course. This idea of like there's a kind of culture war going on between people who take science as kind of their own religion, I guess, their own kind of thing that they think should lead us in telling us about how to act and be in the world. It's not so clear that science does that, right? Some views, like David Hume, a famous philosopher, argued that, there's a distinction between what is and knowledge of what is or exists and what ought to be, right? There's just like a sharp distinction between these two things. So no matter how much knowledge you have about nature, that's not going to tell you how you ought to act, how you should live. So one view of science, which is not actually very common at all, is that science doesn't really tell us anything about how to be as human beings. But if you look, you watch YouTube and you watch popular people in science, they believe it actually does, right? Sometimes by negatively, they say, well, science will show that most religious ideas are not, can't be correct or whatever. And so at least we shouldn't have those particular moral outlooks belonging to those religions. But they also often think that it's associated with its own positive moral outlooks, right? Bruno certainly thought so. Pope thought so. But what would you say today? A typical person, I'm sure you've either met these people or you've seen them on YouTube or something that champion modern science. What do they think we ought to be like? Like, what should we do as human beings? Like, what should our values be? What should we care about? And what should we devote ourselves to? Any ideas?
Generally speaking, I mean, I feel like that's a very subjective question. There is no general idea or belief that all people who prioritize science share. But it's basically the attainment of knowledge. I mean, while in religion, you might believe that your role in life is just to obey religious rules. In science, it's different. You're trying to discover all that is out there. For example, in physics, the highest goal that one could aim to achieve is to find the theory of everything.
Yeah.
So your driving force is essentially to find what's going on in the universe. And I feel like that could also apply to everyday life.
Okay. So my question was more in the direction of, is there a kind of ethical or moral outlook that is shared by most people who take science as the kind of most important aspect of human activity? And I think there is, generally. I'm not saying everyone, you're right, it's a generalization, right? But there's a kind of a tendency for people, and it's not probably because they're scientists, but maybe they're partially scientists because they also have this. So someone like Richard Dawkins would be an example, but there are lots of people like this. They think that they tend to paint other moral views, particularly religious moral views, as being intolerant, right? So they think science should teach us to be tolerant towards other people, to care about other people, things they think wrongly often, but sometimes rightly, other ethical views don't perhaps value as much. They value, supposedly, they don't act like it often, being humble, not claiming to know, right? This is one of the things that they're trying to live in the shadow of Bruno, right? Like, there's so much we don't know, and that's what science tells us, that we should never claim to have authority. So they're children of this kind of Enlightenment idea, right? But today, much more, they think that science teaches us that all people are the same. We all come from the same species, for instance. You know, we're all from the original same biological entities. And so things like racism are narrow-minded. Anyone who wants to set off human beings against one another, this is what human beings shouldn't do. Sometimes behind this is this idea that we're all striving as a species together for the same goals, which is, I guess, perpetuation of humankind. And so we should all cooperate. And I think this is the kind of ethical outlook that they think that they draw often from science. Broadly, it could be called a kind of humanism, right? A kind of valuing of human beings as human beings and seeing them all as one hopefully cooperating, group. And certainly negatively, they have a lot of views about this means that we shouldn't, that the particular views of religion are just false. Many of them think, right? So this is certainly I think an ethical outlook. And you're right. You find extremely religious scientific people and so on, right? But what I meant is like in the popular culture, if you wanted to look at like what people who champion science tend to be like in the media today, that is kind of the way they look at the world. And that's certainly not, and so you might say they tend to be progressive is the term that's used, right? They want to strive towards more and more tolerance, towards, they don't want to have any kind of prejudices about the way human beings should be. Everybody should be able to be how they want, as long as the way they want to be doesn't harm other human beings and so on, right? That's certainly not in any way what Bacon is like, right? He's the exact opposite. He is the example of the person who you hear that they're a scientist and you're surprised to find out that to them that actually confirms their religious standpoint, right? And then they've completely built a worldview in which religion and science go hand in hand, are part of one and the same thing. That's what we'll find. I think that's one of to me, and to most people who read Bacon, they expect they're gonna, his future world is gonna be something that Richard Dawkins thought up, right? And it's absolutely not, because he's all about evidence and empiricism and all this stuff, and like, what is less empirical than religion, right? So he doesn't apply his scientific views to his religious views. That's for sure, right? Because there is, in spirit, a kind of opposition between the two. In this respect, that science in the modern period is built around this idea of thinking for yourself, judging whether something is true for yourself. Whereas religion has always been built upon the idea that there are certain people called prophets or saints or other people who themselves have had firsthand experience of God. They were spoken to, something was revealed to them or whatever. And you must trust and have faith in what they say, right? And you may question some things, but you cannot question the fundamental revealed things. They can be interpreted, of course, but they cannot be questioned, at least not seriously. They can't be rejected at all, right? They're impervious to rejection. And so that does make us kind of fundamental opposition between the spirit of scientific inquiry and the spirit of religious inquiry. And everyone's always recognized this. Even Bacon would have recognized that. But yet, so this shows you, for him, science is not an all-encompassing worldview. Empiricism, or what I say we shouldn't call empiricism, but we should probably call the inductive experimental method, is not an all-encompassing worldview that is to be applied to every single belief for Bacon. And it's certainly not to be applied to religious beliefs and religious ideas. Okay, so anyways, so anyone who would want to look to Bacon as like a hero or a champion or a model for the modern scientific ethical worldview, that would be a bit mistaken. Okay, so let's get any comments on that or other observations on the New Atlantis? We're going to get back to it, but that all made good sense. Yeah. Okay. If you did volunteer, please do turn your cameras on so I can see that you're there and so on. So Miriam, Maya, Sarah. Okay, so we started off seeing that Bacon. So this was the like a preface. We're going to see there are a few different. The real preface comes next, right? This is kind of a foreword about the entire project, right? Also, the preface is about the entire project, so it's going to lay out everything for us. This is kind of following our general line that these first parts of books are usually the most important for us, and in general. And he opens up by, I mentioned last time, he has this kind of very typical method of the period of writing it in the first, well, it's in the third person, but it's put in the, I don't know, you might call it the third/first person, right? It's written in the third person, but it's always about him as an individual, what he thought, right? Descartes will write in the first person, and it's not all that different, right? Similarly with Bruno, although he's writing in the third person, it's always about what that one individual who is him thinks and feels and his projects and so on. And so he doesn't talk as if he's leading an army or something, or that he wants you to believe in his authority. He wants you to examine it for yourself, right? So emphasizing that this method, now method, we're going to find this word here, I highlighted it because, does anyone know what the word method means? Etymology is a fun thing. Maybe you don't think so, but etymology is a very interesting thing. In this case, it's only slightly interesting. Method, anyone know what method means or what it comes from?
We talked before about methodology, how you follow certain steps to reach a conclusion and develop principles and stuff like that. Yeah, so does it come from methodology? Is that your question?
Well, methodology is built out of the word method, right? Methodology takes method and adds ology, which means the study or science of, right? But you said something very interesting. You said the steps you take to reach. Our word,
yeah, because before we talked about, sorry?
There's a metaphor there, right?
Yeah.
Or what's the metaphor? Steps you
Wait, a metaphor?
Yes, a metaphor. Do you
well,
actually take
basically,
steps? Do you actually reach something?
no, we don't actually take steps. We kind of like, no, it's not, not literally.
So what's the metaphor? It's with walking, right? Towards a location. This is the metaphor that's being used. So our language is built upon metaphors so much so that you're having trouble even recognizing there's one there.
Yeah, that's true.
Words are built on metaphors as well. Method comes from the Greek metahodos, which means the path along which you travel.
Oh, okay.
That's what a method is. It's the way you take. And I like emphasizing that, just like principle, beginning, and so on, right? This kind of solidifies in your mind what the core meaning of that is. And so method, we use the word methodology without even thinking about it, right? But what the word method brings forward is that it has a goal. Methods have goals, and everyone knows what the goal is, but the method you choose is the particular path along which you pursue that goal, right? So there's method always involves making a choice, about which path you take and how you guide yourself on that path. And all of these extensions of that metaphor are very useful, right? Like, what do you use to guide you? How do you navigate on that path? What rules do you take? The rule might be, you know, when I reach an intersection, I always turn right. That'll usually get you going in a circle. Yeah. The intersection, you know, the rule might be I always follow the street sign that has the destination on it that I want, or whatever, right? So involved in a method is a kind of way of navigating certain rules about how to make decisions at certain points, how to choose the next step, and how to link up the next step with the previous step, right? Many different possible steps could follow any given step. And so at every moment, the method is that thing. Now, methodology, unfortunately, people use these terms very broadly and carelessly, so they lose their meaning a little bit, right? Methodology should be the study of methods, right? It should be the study of the different possible methods you could use. So instead of method, most people use the word methodology, though, because it sounds all sciencey, when they should just use method, right? This was my method. That's the real word. You shouldn't say this was my methodology. It's like saying, I don't know, I used navigation theory to navigate. I should say I used my compass, right? You didn't use navigation theory. So anyways, so this is the method. It's the same thing as methodology for most of us, that he designed for himself. And we saw the first step of that had to do with, so in designing that method is built upon this idea that, for the one, the human intellect can find, so he believes fundamentally that the mind and the body, the human being, is capable of truth. That's not a trivial belief. Most of us believe it. A good many people don't. And the more people the further you get in science and philosophy, the more people oddly don't. The ones who have more knowledge eventually sometimes think, well, maybe knowledge is not really even possible, paradoxically enough. But for the most part, we believe, and he believes, based essentially upon a religious belief, that God intended us to know things. So he believes that also we saw that there was some kind of like original state in which the mind knew nature uncorruptedly, perfectly. And we've lost that. So for him, the question of a method is the question not of discovering an entirely new territory, but of finding our way back to our original territory. It's a kind of homecoming, right? We should have a kind of nostalgia for the knowledge we once had. And why did we lose our way, though? Because of ourselves, right? He says the human intellect here is the source of its own problems, and it ignores the very real aids. So although we are the source of our problems, God gave us the tools by which we can be restored to that original state of knowledge. But we've ignored them for thousands of years, right? And so he's going to have to tell a story here about, first of all, how do you know, Bacon, that we've ignored them? Like, what's your evidence? The human mind hasn't made any progress. And so he's going to go through that, and he's going to explain and detail the current state of the sciences, all right? He also has to have a little bit of a story about how is it possible that you are just so darn smart that for thousands of years, people who seem to be just as intelligent as you have entirely missed the truth and have always misused their minds. And you, little Englishman that you are, came along just by chance, and in your own personal time, for yourself, designed the one true method that all human beings ought to be using, and somehow weren't able to come up with before, right? How can you explain the fact that make this plausible to us, right? And he's going to do that by detailing all those all those sources of error that are in human nature and emphasizing how strong they are and how we never had the right method to deal with them. So the first step of the method is that the method should be designed to overcome the obstacles that the human mind puts in its own path. Right? So it's not first the rocks and the trees and things in the forest that are going to be the obstacles. It's going to be the fact we don't know how to walk yet, right? And we've been trying to walk on our hands the whole time, or we should have been trying to walk on our feet. Okay, and we saw that last time as well, that he very quickly here then starts with a diagnosis. And this is going to also partially explain that other point about how could human beings have missed it for so long. And it's with this idea of first notions, first concepts. The word notion just means a concept or idea, except it sounds a little more, I don't know, vague, I suppose, the word notion. But it comes from a very, very proper Latin term, which means it's just used for a note. It's related, right? Notion is related to note. Noti, which means a characteristic or feature, or a concept in this case. So his idea is the very first notions of things, and by very first he means first in the order of demonstrating things, right? The very first concepts we use to prove everything else in our deductive science, those themselves are incorrect, right? Now, one thing I didn't say earlier that I should probably say right now is that although Bacon advances, this idea of the inductive scientific method, you already know he didn't invent it, but also the inductive experimental method because that's his priority, doesn't mean that the deductive method is not also part of science for him. Everyone thinks, because you could think about it, remember we're talking about this television set idea of you could either try to start with the first concepts of electrons and so on, so those would be our first notions in this case, and then try to construct a television out of those first notions so that you finally understand it. Or you could start with the actual whole television and break it down into its parts. You're doing that, you're taking the same path, right? But in two different directions. So the method of one should some way be related to the method of the other. And they are in that they move in opposite directions. Remember, one went from wholes to parts, and one went from parts to wholes. One went from causes to effects, and one went from effects to causes. Those are just the same path, right? But in opposite directions. So if you are doing induction, you should be able to start with the things of the world, derive, analyze things until you get to the first notions. And then you could turn around, if you like, and put all that stuff in the form of a deductive science, right? You could present it that way. And that's often what we do, even in mathematics textbooks and so on today. I don't know, this is probably an unimportant aside for you, but if you look in like graduate level mathematics books, they no longer present things like they do in your high school calculus books or whatever. They don't present a problem and teach you how to solve it. They start with the axioms, right? And then they move on to the theorems. And it's impossible to read these books because you have to go through a whole training just to read them, because they're not presenting it to you in the order they themselves even discovered it. They're presenting it according to this deductive structure, right? Because they believe that's the way you should present it, because that's the way supposedly not things work, right? Electrons cause wires to work in a certain way. The wires cause the TV to work in a certain way, and so on. So the proper way to present it should be the deductive method. It goes from the first easiest things to the most complicated things. But that's not how anyone learns anything or discovers anything according to Bacon. For Descartes, we'll see that is a way of also discovery. So long story short, everyone, including Descartes later, who will really emphasize the deductive method, they believe both methods have their roles in science. The question is, which one should be the primary method by which science progresses and makes its discoveries? That's the key question. So Bacon is going to say deduction in the past was supposed to fulfill that role, and it cannot by its very nature do so. It's induction that can lead to discovery and to fruits, and deduction should be reserved only for presenting knowledge to other scholars. So deduction is only a method of teaching and presenting, not very important, right? Still there, still useful, but not the heart of science by any means. And if we never got to that part of science, he doesn't think it would really make much of a difference, because science could proceed and go on and so forth just with its inductive method. So, but others
I just have a question.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
About the structure of the text. In earlier readings, we said that sometimes the text could have the structure of the thing it's trying to describe.
Yeah.
But Bacon doesn't follow that, right? When he's talking about induction.
Yeah. I mean, okay, I can, you're right that I can say some things that have this structural idea from Bacon. So what I think is Bacon's writing actually reflects the structure of the institutions that he thinks should be created. Not the, and those do reflect the structure of the science itself. So I think he might have had some idea there. Also, noticeably when we get to his book on methodology, the New Organon, it's written as a number of fragmentary pieces that you have to read over and over again and collect, kind of like an empirical induction. So I think there's something going on there, but you're certainly right that it's not as explicit. It's not as obvious. It's much more obvious for people who believe in deduction, right? Because they form the structure of their books deductively and start with the simple stuff and build up by derivations and theorems and so on. And some philosophers even, particularly later in the period, they just straightforwardly for philosophical and other texts adopted the model of Euclid, deductive. So if you've heard of a very famous philosopher named Spinoza from the modern period. His book called The Ethics starts with definitions and theorems, right? And each book is a series of demonstrations from theorems, right? And he even uses like lemmas and all these kinds of very technical structure of mathematical texts. But since Bacon, it's not so easy for Bacon because he has that's the inductive method, right? So, but I think it is very interesting that then when we look at the New Organon, if you look down, it's the least systematic in terms of its structure of all the readings we have, right? Let's find a swath of it. Oh, it's here, right? Just a heading and then some stuff about some point, and then a heading, and then about something completely different, and then another heading, and he kind of goes in circles. So like the 5th, 12th, and 25th all deal with the same topic in different ways. So you kind of have to do your own examination and induction to say, oh, if we put these together, we get this general idea. So hopefully that was his idea. That's a very nice idea, even if it's not the one that he had in mind. Okay. But very good question. The structure of the science, though, itself is very structured. But it's structured in terms of like roles or functions. Who does what? Just like the, as you read The New Atlantis, you saw that the House of Solomon is very structured, right? According to the functions within the method, the different parts of the method itself. Okay. Okay. Let me get back to where I was. First notions of things. So the idea there is most everyone, he believes, emphasize the deductive method. And the deductive method proves everything else based upon first notions. And a fundamental part of the deductive method is the belief that the first notions cannot be proven. They have to be self-evident. So they say if there's going to be knowledge, it's got to be deductive. And if there's going to be deductive knowledge is a path, right, from something to something else. And if your path has no beginning, you can't get started. Your method only tells you how to get from one step to another, but there's no step before the first step. So or it only tells you how to choose your next step based upon your previous step. But all the rules that would tell you that can't apply because there's no step to apply them to find out what the next step would be. So the first step either has to be self-evident or it can't be, or we can't have knowledge at all. That's how, even Plato realized this and kind of thought of this as kind of a paradox of knowledge, right? If you explain something, and you two can puzzle over this paradox, if you think about it, everything you know because you can explain it in terms of something else, right? If I say, what is an electron? You have to explain it in terms of something else. If I ask you what a cat is, you got to explain it in terms of something else. It's a kind of animal, and so on and so forth. If the idea is that you always have to explain something in terms of something else, there's only a couple possibilities. You eventually end, if I keep asking you, well, then explain the next thing, explain the next thing, explain the next thing. Eventually you have to say that first thing, that everything else is based, either there is a first thing, right? Eventually you're like, well, no, this is the end. This explains everything else. And I say, now explain it to me. And you say, I can't. And so I say, you don't know it. And so all that knowledge you had is based upon something you don't know. That would be the result. Not very satisfying. That knowledge is built out of non-knowledge. Or you have to say that you go in a circle at some point, right? We all know that's not very good either. If you say, what is a cat? And I say, well, it's a kind of animal with fur. And you say, what is an animal with fur? And I say, well, it's a cat. And then you say, what is a cat? And I say, it's an animal with fur. And we go around and around. You say, I'm an idiot. I don't know what I'm talking about. Yeah. If I can't say any more, if that's truly all I can do, then I don't know what I'm talking about. So in either way, it seems we don't know anything. That seems to be a problem, right? But that's because we're presupposing this kind of deductive model of knowledge. Knowledge comes from being able to demonstrate and explain things from more basic concepts. So the people who believe in the deductive method generally bite the bullet on that. And they say, yeah, when we get to those first concepts and ideas, I can't explain them in terms of anything else, but I also know them. They have some special feature about them that as soon as you think about them, you know them. You don't have to know them from anything else. They can be known from themselves. So we'll see in Descartes, he has this idea that, for instance, when you get back to a point, you can't explain a point in terms of anything else. Anything more basic, right? Whenever you try to explain a point, you refer to things that are more complicated. You say it's like a sliver, like a little one-dimensional sliver of space. And then as soon as you try to ask someone what one dimension is or what space is, they have to talk about points at some point. So they end up going in circles there. But they say, but that's okay because a point is so simple. The idea is so simple and self-evident that I don't need to be able to explain it to claim that I know what it is. Right? Now, Bacon thinks that that is a whole bunch of hogwash. There are no such things. What those are is the most bland, obvious human prejudices. Those are the things that seem to be unquestionably true to us. And so what does deduction do? It builds the world out of the most uninteresting, unimaginative human prejudices. That's what it does. And those are the first notions. So it's when we have the first notions of things, the very first notions that people try to explain everything in terms of, they themselves are poorly devised and understood. They're false. So his first step is going to be, we have to go back and re-examine even the first notions and put those to the test of deduction or induction and experiment. Even the very first notions that we think we have, those are the ones we should focus on and try to tear apart, which is something that deduction obviously never did because it assumed them, okay? And because once the foundation, this is another metaphor here, the foundation of knowledge is corrupted, the building itself is corrupted, everything built upon it. So he says here, and they like this metaphor of construction here, or in this case, it's the consequence is that general human reason, which we bring to bear on the inquiry into nature, is not well-founded and properly constructed. It is like a magnificent palace without a foundation. Right? So he proposes, he says the only course remaining is to start again, right? By other means, using another method, a different method, and make a general renewal of the sciences. That's the whole project, a renewal, a restoration, and of all human learning, beginning from correct foundations. This might seem on approach to be something illimitably vast and beyond mortal strength. And yet in the treatment will be found to be sane and sensible, more so than what has been done in the past. Already here he's starting to grapple with this, as everyone will in this period, the fact that they sound like they are being extremely immodest, right? As I said, putting himself in the place of correcting all of human civilization up to that point. The whole past is wrong. I found the truth. Here's how I found the truth. And here he's saying it sounds like it's an amazingly grand thing, putting the human mind back on the true path of knowledge, but it's far less grand than you think. This is a typical strategy of the period, you'll see. They'll say, it sounds so great, but really all I'm doing is reducing errors. It was those other people who had grand plans. I'm going to do something very simple. It's going to be very simple. And you'll find out it is a bit underwhelming, right? Just saying do induction better. Build institutions to do induction. That's it. So he says, for one can see an end to it. So he's saying his task is very well defined. His method is to lead to a well-defined goal, whereas in the past, the goal and the method was not clearly defined, and he believes the way it was constructed, it would never end. Knowledge, according to the deductive path, doesn't ever lead to true knowledge, and so we're continually stuck in this process of failing to reach our goal, and so that becomes an endless, unlimited task, whereas induction is a very limited, finite, determinate thing, right? So he says in the current sciences, so now in the next couple of paragraphs, he's going to diagnose the current state of the sciences to show that they're not making progress, right? He says there's a kind of giddiness. People are like excited and a perpetual agitation and a going in a circle, right? People are all eager to discover new things, but they never make any true progress. Because there's no true method, right? So they're going along their path and they continually return to their starting point because they start off too quickly. So he says he was particularly moved. Okay, so here's one of the reasons why he brought it forward. He was particularly moved by the argument that he had not so far found anyone who had applied their mind to similar thoughts. This is just an aside here. Again, emphasizing the originality of the project he's putting forward. And he's saying beneficently, I found no one else had said this, so since I came up with it, I should share it with others. and therefore he decided to give to the public the first parts of what he had completed. This indicates his genuine concern for the human race. So this is couched in a kind of humanism, right? Good for people, not for the greatness of kings or patrons or whatever. Not as in the medieval period, priests who did science would do it for the glory of God. He doesn't say this is for the glory of God or anything like that, even though he's religious. Science has a human purpose. Now, it has a theological underpinning with this idea that God intended us to do this. But what God intended for us to do was to help ourselves. That's the idea. Not for God's glory, but for our own good. So science has a humanistic, and he did not seek any reward for himself, right? So he's just doing this for everyone else. We'll get to this this part about the current state of the sciences, but these are the next paragraphs I'm talking about, by the way. That might have been a bit confusing. So the preface here will take us through, and you'll notice he uses the Pillars of Hercules here, right? That's in this first part of the preface. It's kind of the imagery that he's using. But let's look at the title here. So the state of the sciences, neither prosperous nor advanced, and quite different ways of open up for the human intellect that men have known in the past, and new aids are devised, so that the mind may exercise its right over nature, right? Just a piece of text to confirm that, something I'd already said. This idea of restoring we have a rightful, if you ask today, he wouldn't be a vegetarian, Bacon. He wouldn't be an animal rights activist, Bacon. He believes that mankind has divine authority. The world was created for our use. And so we have rightful power over the things in it. And you probably noticed this, someone else who volunteered, or if not, then Akasha, because if you volunteer and you don't say anything, I'm going to strike your name off these lists, right? Are animals mentioned in the New Atlantis? You think? The end part of the New Atlantis, when he's talking about the scientific institution and the kinds of experiments they undertake, what kind of experiments do they generally do? Did you notice any pattern there? The kind of experiments they carry out? It's not what we do quite, although it might sound abstractly like it. So he's got this idea that we have to look at diversity, right? Remember, so one of the prejudices that we have that he'll diagnose, that you all are familiar with now, because it's in the YouTube generation, it's gained its own title, confirmation bias. You've probably heard of this before. The idea that we tend to notice evidence that supports theories we already have. So if I tell you number 46 is the most common number in the world, you will start seeing 46 everywhere. And suddenly it'll get annoying to you. I think there's a Jim Carrey movie with this, something. This is just true. Conspiracy theories, if you want to look at like similarities between US presidents who were assassinated, you'll suddenly find all these confirming similarities, right? The type of car that Kennedy was assassinated in was a Lincoln, and Lincoln was assassinated, and da-da-da-da. And if your theory is like all this stuff is connected in some way, you'll find evidence to support it. That's because your mind tends to ignore, doesn't notice 35 because no one told you to look for 35. And you think you never see 46 ever, right? Like, who sees 46? But it's around you all the time. You just don't notice it until I tell you it's the most common number in the world. And then suddenly every time you see it, you say, oh, there's 46 again. And this builds up a kind of bias towards the theories you think are true. You see them everywhere, all right? That's part of intelligence. Unfortunately, it also leads to error, right? Because it leads to a certain bias. Well, confirmation bias, for this is one of the things that Bacon's going to talk about quite extensively. And so what we have to do in our experiments is, as soon as we test something in one circumstance, we don't continue looking in that way. We look at like the cases that are so different from it that will put it to the real test, right? So we explicitly take our initial experiments and then try to devise experiments where it's least likely for the thing to turn out to be true. That's how we test, so we find counter possibilities. So what this means for him is that in experimentation in the New Atlantis, in the House of Solomon, in the scientific institution of the New Atlantis, everything is tried in the complete range of possibilities. And the whole structure of the scientific system is built this way. So he wants to carry out experiments deep underground, at sea level, and high in the sky, right? It's got to be at like all three levels. Or, and you'll see this is a theme all throughout. He's got everything is done in this way, so that it's throughout the whole range of possibilities. Now, he talks about experimenting on fruits and vegetables and also animals, right? This is coming back to our point.
And land and sea.
Yeah, so things on land and sea. But what does he talk about animals? He wants to make them extremely large, right? But also extremely small, miniatures, little cows, right? Little rabbits, gargantuan cows, gargantuan rabbits. He says they do this. He's not explaining what they're trying to do with the New Atlantis. They've done all these things. They have experiments where they on how to make poisons just to kill animals, he says. So they make chemicals to bring animals to life and to kill them. They make animals, so there's it's like this torture chamber of science. It seems to be for no other purpose than to demonstrate the power of science, the power of manipulation. And so just coming back to that point about our right over nature, we demonstrate and recover that right over nature by kind of like almost maniacally manipulating it, right? We don't need miniature cows, but if science can do it, then it does it in Bacon's New Atlantis, right? We don't need to kill the animals. We don't need many of these things that he's talking about. It's not driven by need. It's driven by the gaining the range of knowledge and showing the range of power that science can have to turn all things in nature and to be complete master over nature. And so he has no concern with poisoning animals just for fun, essentially, or breeding them with one another, right? Breeding cows with pigs and all these kinds of weird things he talks about. Same thing with fruits, enormous fruits, tiny fruits. Now this we do, right? Okay.
Is that related to Romanticism in any way? Because while he says, or he claims that science gives us power over nature, throughout his demonstrations, that's not what's obvious. He's like painting nature in a negative sense, or that it's not, like what we're doing is not natural. So is it related to Romanticism in any way?
No, because he believes those things are natural. For him, he along with Descartes and others see that this notion of what you and I are still somehow Aristotelians, which is a bit weird on this point. We still think of like fish swimming happy in the ocean is what's natural, and the fish sitting on my plate cooked is not natural, right? We think of human activity as not natural. But for Bacon, that distinction is nonsense. He says we only control nature by obeying it. We have to know about nature. Nature produces these things through so we can control it. We can tell it, kind of determine what it will produce, but we can't make nature produce these things. A small cow can only be made if nature can make it. We just use nature. Like we use other chemicals or whatever. Those are all parts of nature. So he doesn't think of coming from Aristotle, there's this fundamental distinction between technology, human activity, and natural activity. And modern science has gotten rid of that. It exists in our popular culture. But, when people say that, genetically modified things are not natural, that really doesn't have any sense to it anymore. The only thing that's behind that is that when you manipulate things in nature, you don't understand them very well, and they haven't been around for very long. So they might have surprising effects that you don't know about, right? So if you engineer something, a chemical, it didn't exist in your environment before. So we have evolved to exist in our own environment, right? And so maybe it kills us. We didn't expect that. That's not unnatural. It's natural because it's a chemical that kills us, and it's natural to die when something disrupts, the chemical pathways in your body. But that's really what's maybe behind the distinction with nature, and perhaps some of the ideas with we don't know what will happen if we genetically modify certain plants, what it will do to the environment. Not because they're unnatural, but because they're being introduced into an environment that didn't have them before, and they might have unexpected consequences. I think does that clarify things? Do you think that's right?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. But so for Bacon, this wouldn't be unnatural at all to him. This is actually showing you your view of nature is unnatural to him. All right. It's part of the human prejudice. Well, nature's always been this way, so that's the only way nature can be. Well, have you studied it? Have you seen what nature can do in the most extreme circumstances? You might look at some of these sea creatures that are at the bottom of the deepest parts of the ocean and say, that looks unnatural to me. But that's simply because you haven't exposed yourself to the range of possibilities that are in nature. Okay. So part of okay, well, first part, man seems to have no good sense either of their resources or of their power, but to exaggerate the former and to underrate the latter, right? So again, he's going to start here. This is going to be an examination, human beings, man, examining themselves, right? And we just completely have a distorted picture of ourselves. We think we're capable of things we're not capable of, and we miss the real benefits and things. So you see this in deduction. You're saying deduction simply does not use the senses at all after the first step. The senses are one of the most important tools for knowledge, and we're just ignoring it. It's actually built into the science that you ignore it. When you do a demonstration in geometry, none of that is based upon sense experience. You give that up at the first moment, right? So either they put an insane value on the arts and they have already have and look no further. So he's thinking of like Aristotelians who they look no further. Whenever you raise a new question, they say, well, what did Aristotle say about it? And then everything turns into a discussion of Aristotle, like what he meant by this and that. You say, well, let's discuss this problem in optics. And they say, well, what does Aristotle think about it? And then you spend books and books and books arguing about what Aristotle thought about some optical problem. And you say, but why don't we, this is for Bacon, why don't we just get out our optical instruments, put Aristotle on the bookshelf, and look at it ourselves and see what happens, right? And see if we can figure it out. He says people don't do that. They overvalue. They say, how could you do that to Aristotle? He is the authority. Who are you to think that you yourself, unaided, could just use your eyes and your brain to come up with these theories yourself? No, we should trust the past, right? And that's how people have progressed, why they haven't progressed in science. So they are like the fatal pillars of Hercules of the sciences, for they are not stirred by the desire and the hope to go further. There is built into this, going back to that image that he does, the fatal pillars of, he's seeing those daring adventurers who were risking their lives, right, for wealth and for stupid reasons probably. But without that, without the foolhardiness, there would be no progress, right? So he's going to praise, he's going to say, even though it may lead you off to your death intellectually, sticking to what is safe doesn't repay it. We've all been sticking to what is safe. We have to kind of step out into what we don't know and which may fail. So it's about risk taking. A lot of it is, he's going to emphasize the importance of taking risks. And to take risks, and a lot of students don't like this, but and saying, well, if you take risks like that, if you met someone like Columbus, what do you think he would be like? He not only took risks, but he was probably a jerk, right? Because other people went to him and said, you know, I've done calculations based upon shadows in Greece at the same time of day and in Europe, and it looks to me like the Earth is a whole heck of a lot bigger than you think it is. And what did, undoubtedly Columbus said, oh, no, I read in some text, blah, 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 blah. You're completely wrong. And forcefully so, such that he could go and persuade kings that he was right? He must have not respected authority whatsoever. He looked up for all these crackpot reasons. He was probably completely brainwashed by his own confirmation bias, because he needed the Earth to be small, and so he collected, we know that he collected whatever piece of ancient literature or whatever he could find that mentioned the Earth being smaller or possibly smaller to support his case. But so built into it is not only recklessness, but for Bacon, a disrespect of authority. You have to, students realize this too, some of them. The more smart they think they are, now, this is one of the double-edged things about education, right? The students who are jerks sometimes, who think they're really smart, are often, not always, there is the person who's very confident and is a jerk and doesn't know what they're talking about also, which is very, very common. But if you just repeat what the professor says and you don't challenge your professors, you don't challenge the state of things, you got to have a little bit of disrespect there, right? Or else you're not going to get anywhere. And cultures in which respect for elders is held too highly still today have trouble in sciences. For instance, I have colleagues who are Japanese, and they say, for instance, you cannot do philosophy in Japan because in Japan they have such respect for their elders that your 82-year-old thesis advisor, you have to say everything he says is true. No matter whether you think it's false or not. You can't go out and publicly challenge anyone who is your senior. And they've complained to me about this. I mean, I don't have firsthand experience, so I can't verify it. They just say that this is a horrible problem. It's also a problem in China because you can't disrespect the authority of the communist. Some of you may know this. In departments in China, in the university, every department has a political appointee who is within that department and keeps an eye on what people say and what they teach. So there is a real problem with studying anything but Marx and Marxist interpretations and so on in China, still to today. It's still a huge problem. And that's a version of authority, right? And Bacon is saying science doesn't progress under this. But this means you got to kind of be a jerk to, and he kind of is. He's a jerk towards Aristotle and others. So he says, we must rid ourselves of the excess veneration and regard, with a useful warning that men should not exaggerate or celebrate their abundance and its usefulness. So we have to rid ourselves of the belief that we have knowledge. We shouldn't respect ourselves in a certain way as well, which I guess that's a mitigating factor. Akasha, would you like to read the next passage? Or actually, you've been talking a lot. Someone else,
Yeah,
Miriam, would you like to read the passage?
Sure. The highlighted one?
Yes, because if I keep on this way, we're going to have
okay.
to raise Akasha's, we're going to have to raise her tuition because she's getting a private lesson. And that's very expensive. Yes, go ahead, Miriam.
Okay. One must also speak plainly about usefulness and say that the wisdom which we have drawn in particular from the Greeks seems to be kind of childish stage of science, and to have a child's characteristic of being all too ready to talk, but too weak and immature to produce anything.
Keep going.
For it is fertile in controversies and feeble in results. The story of Scylla
Scylla, yeah.
seems to fit the current state of the letters. Scylla seems to fit the current state of the letters exactly. She showed the face of and visage of a virgin, but barking monsters clothed and clung to her loins. Similarly, the sciences to which we are accustomed have certain bland and specious generalities. But when we get to particulars, which are like the generative parts, so that they may bring forth fruit and works from themselves, disputes and scrappy controversies start up, and that is where it ends. That is all the fruit they have to show.
Okay, this is a bit of a funny. Do any of you know what Scylla is from?
No.
It's from. Yeah, go ahead.
Odyssey, or
The Odyssey.
is it from the Odyssey?
So the Odyssey, you're right, Homer's Odyssey. On the trip through the stories of the adventures that Odysseus tells to his Phaeacian hosts, he tells a story that he had to make a choice when traveling on his ship. He had to go between Scylla and Charybdis. Charybdis is this big whirlpool, right? On the one side, and he had to decide whether to go closer to it and possibly get sucked into this vortex, or to go closer to these caves containing this being called Scylla, which was seductive and beautiful and made all the men want to sleep with her, right? But as he says, and this is a bit subtle in the text, barking monsters clothed and clung to her loins. So the men were attracted to her, but under her dress were monsters that killed them, right? So, and he even makes this further. So he says, this is what the sciences were like. Well, the Greek sciences, he says, are kind of a childish thing, right? Too weak and immature, but ready to talk and walk, right? They want to go, but they keep falling down. But he says, the current state of the science have become accustomed to specious, bland generality. So if you look at the sciences broadly, they're very beautiful. They're very seductive, like this Scylla, right? All men want to sleep with science, I guess. But as soon as they get to it, under her dress are monsters, right? So he even refers here to the generative parts. This is about giving children, birth, fruits. So he says, the other science, the bad science, is fertile in controversies. It gives birth to fruits, right? Children. Fruit of the loins, that is a phrase referring to children. It's an odd thing to refer to children as fruit, but hopefully they're a little more than fruit, but that's the idea, right? To generate children, fruit. The fruit of the old science is not knowledge or results, it's controversies, it's disputes, it's books upon books upon books discussing interpretations of this and that, and so on. So no progress. So while everyone, when they're in the ideas, when you're young, perhaps you're attracted to the sciences, but as soon as you get involved with the details, nothing is generated but scrappy controversies, where it ends, and that all is the fruit that they have to show. The only thing produced by science in his time is dispute and discussion, no knowledge, right? So remember that. That's a nice little, again, I guess it's a simile in this case. So he's going to contrast this with his, so in this new science, he says, philosophy and intellectual sciences are like statues, admired and venerated, but not improved. Moreover, they are sometimes at their best in their earliest author and then decline. So again, what's he doing here? He's going through the evidence that the current state of the sciences is not good. They're only fruit. The first thing he presents is, what is their fruit? What is the result of the sciences? Not knowledge, controversy. Even worse, or not even worse, but the next piece, what we find among the sciences is that they don't start simple and mediocre and get better. Rather, it seems to be the opposite. Think about the authority of Aristotle. People act like Aristotle was the greatest of all philosophers and scientists, and everyone after him is worse. It's always about returning to and reconstructing what Aristotle thought on a point, as if the sciences when they were created were perfect and have just been continuously getting worse as we go on, right? Study Ptolemy, study Galen, study whatever. I mean, it's all about going back to the first authority as if they were perfect. And so the sciences as he sees them now, they seem to be in decline. That seems to be how they understand themselves, as always in decline, always needing to go back to something that was better. So moreover, they seem to be their best in the earliest author and then decline. For after men have joined a sect and committed themselves to ones like obsequious courtiers, this would be a very, very potent phrase in his time, because everything was built around the king and their courts, right? And people sucking up to the king to get power. And that's what an obsequious courtier is. Person who goes to the king and says, oh, you're so beautiful, you're so handsome, you're so intelligent, please give me some money. Please give me a title, please so-and-so. That's how people act towards the first Aristotle and others, saying they suck up to their authority. For men after they've joined a sect and committed themselves to one man's opinion, they add no distinction to the sciences themselves. I mean, they add no special qualities themselves, right? But act like servants in courting and adorning their authors. That's what they do. What is another sign that the sciences have not progressing? Well, I say here, because we have, in short, no good history of past discoveries. You might say this might be initially a little surprising, because you think, well, Bacon thinks that we need to do all these experiments and induction. So he's going to say, get out there and start doing induction. Stop reading Aristotle. But he says, no, we do need to read Aristotle, and we need to see what he knew. We don't need to get involved in controversies about what he thought. We should just draw up. In fact, we need records of what everyone has said in the past, but we're not going to treat it as an authority. We're going to treat it as a source. a source of possible knowledge and ideas. In other words, we're going to treat the past according to the method of induction itself. Induction and experiment, essentially, applied to history. We're going to use history as data, another way of putting that, as the data for part of our science. And why not? Just as I can collect, I can sail all over the world to collect information about different animals, I can too read books written in different parts of the world and written at different periods in history to see what people thought and what information they had about the past. Now, all of that has to be critically, none of that is taken on authority, right? It's all taken as potential evidence. So he thinks this is very important, and it's a sign that the sciences haven't progressed, or a reason they haven't progressed, and also a sign, is that there's no, this is like an encyclopedia. There is no collection, a place in which all knowledge is collected together and recorded. Now, of course, that is one of the divisions within the New Atlantis, right? In the House of Solomon, there are the people who keep and collect what's called natural history, right? It says, for we're most importantly ignorant of what has become known and published in the sciences and arts in different centuries and in other places, and much more ignorant of what has been tried by individuals and discussed in private. This is also going to set a kind of path for the future. Induction isn't, in principle, it shouldn't be, now the way he envisions this in the New Atlantis is kind of bizarre. You would think, and this is how it historically worked out, that science began not only to publish its results and so on and bring its results to a wider public, it also started drawing from a wider public, right? In the early periods, there's just one or two, very few scientists. Today, how many scientists are there? Hundreds of thousands of people working in science, maybe millions working in science. And they collect information from all over, from all different, and the boundary between science and technicians is not very clear, right? Doctors are also practicing scientists, many of them, right? They write papers, but they also cure people. They gather some of their knowledge from their firsthand experience of cases, right? And so they're drawing, this is what he's talking about. In the past, scientists or people who did science were cut off from practitioners. So people who practice metallurgy, right? Like making alloys for swords and things like this, or people who were doctors and so on, they didn't contribute to knowledge, although they were the ones who had the most firsthand experience of things. And science should be drawing from their experiences. They are the closest practicing experiencers. So you might want to collect information from people who work in, if you're theorizing, have theories about how metals work, you're writing a book on this, you might want to talk to people who actually work with metals and see what kind of knowledge they built up over the years. But no one ever did that. No one ever collected information from these workers, from practitioners. And so that's something that will happen in the past, and it's now integrated into science, right? All sciences have this kind of practical connection with what goes on in the world. Now in the New Atlantis, that's not as evident, because how many people work in the, someone want to tell me approximately how many people work in the House of Solomon? We say 5, 2 dozen, 1,000, 10,000. What do you think? $10,000? No? Maybe 2 dozen, right? About there. He likes threes. He seems to like threes, right? Everything is divided into three. No, Safa, I don't think 30,000. I think maybe about 2 dozen, maybe 3 dozen, 24, 36, something like that. He likes threes, and he likes like, but he also, so like in each laboratory he has, like there's a hermit who lives up in the sky, who does experiments in the sky. And there's someone who lives underground. And it's not like teams. He doesn't see this idea of like huge numbers of people. Where he collects knowledge from the past, though, he has this kind of like secret CIA of people who travel around the world and collect the science from. Jenna hates to interrupt me, but tells me we are 5 minutes past. Okay, we will continue there on Tuesday. I may send you an email. There's no new reading. You should just make sure that your annotations are done by Sunday through the New Atlantis, and I'll see you on Tuesday of next week. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, doctor.
Thank you too.
Bye.